Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. Elias Ward rode into the open stretch of the frontier just after midday, his horse's steps slow and uneven from the long trail behind them. The wind pressed against his coat, carrying dust and the faint smell of rain. His eyes were tired, deeply tired, not from a single night, but from months of broken rest. He hadn't slept safely in years, not since the incident he never spoke about, the one that kept him waking with his hand on a gun before his mind had time to catch up. He spotted the homestead from a distance, a small cabin set against the hill, a corral, a few horses grazing close, and a fence that had collapsed in several sections. The land looked worn but cared for. Someone had tried to keep it alive despite hardships. As he approached, he saw two women standing near the broken fence. They watched him carefully, their posture controlled, their expressions unreadable at first glance. Apache women, close in age yet different in presence. Ahiona, the older one, stood with both feet planted firmly, hands steady on her waist. She had the posture of someone who had carried responsibility for too long and no longer waited for help to arrive. Her face showed patience mixed with guarded concern. Nayeli, younger and more expressive, tried to appear brave but kept glancing at the tree line, scanning for danger. Her movements were quick, revealing tension beneath the surface. The sisters had lost most of their family to conflicts that moved across the territory in waves. They had remained on the land because leaving meant surrendering everything their parents built. Their mission now was simple but heavy: stay alive, hold the homestead, and keep their horses safe. The fence was their first line of protection. Without it, a wandering predator or a hostile rider could take everything from them. Elias slowed his horse as he neared. He didn't lift his hand in greeting, not out of disrespect, but because he had learned that sudden movements made people think the wrong thing. He stopped several paces away and dismounted with care. Iona spoke first, her voice calm but firm. "You passing through?" Elias nodded once. "Storm hit your fence hard." "We know." Ahiona crossed her arms, studying him. "We can't fix it fast enough." Nayeli stepped forward with a slight tremor in her breath. "We can pay in food or whatever we have." Elias looked at the fence again. The rails were split, the posts weakened. A lot of work for two people who were already worn thin. He felt the familiar pull inside, something between responsibility and guilt. He had spent too long watching people struggle while he avoided staying anywhere for more than a night. Maybe he was tired of running. Maybe he just didn't want to see fear on someone else's face again. "I'll fix it," he said. A relief flickered across Nayeli's face. Ahiona held her steady, not trusting good news too quickly. Elias added, "Free of charge." The sisters exchanged a confused look. Ahiona frowned slightly. "Why would you do that?" Elias took a slow breath. This was the part he hated explaining. One condition: their bodies shifted almost at the same time. Ahiona straightening, Nayeli pulling back half a step. Elias kept his tone calm, controlled, respectful. "Tonight, I sleep between the two of you." Nayeli's eyes widened with alarm. Ahiona's jaw tensed. Before either spoke, Elias raised a hand slightly, slowly, carefully. "It isn't what you think." They waited, silent and tense. "I don't sleep safe," he continued. "If someone comes at me in the dark or wakes me wrong, I react first. I don't want to mistake either of you for trouble, and I don't want danger slipping past me. If I sleep between you, I'll know you're safe, and I won't grab for my gun without reason." He didn't lower his gaze. He wanted them to see the truth plainly. "I'm asking you so nothing goes wrong. For any of us." The explanation hung in the air. The storm clouds gathered above the hills, pressing a cold wind over the homestead. The sisters processed his words with different reactions. Ahiona studied him carefully, searching his posture for deception. She noted the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he kept his hands visible, the exhaustion in his voice. Nothing suggested desire or threat, only caution. Nayeli glanced at Elias's horse, the loose saddlebags, the worn look in his eyes. He looked like someone who had been driven out of sleep too many times and no longer trusted his own instincts. Ahiona finally spoke. You give your word that's the only reason?" "Yes," Elias answered. "I'm here to help, not to harm." Naeli lowered her eyes briefly, then nodded. "We accept." Ahiona hesitated one last moment, then gave a short, decisive nod. "Fine. Fix the fence. Stay the night. We'll manage the rest as it comes." Elias let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. He felt the familiar edge of stress fade, just slightly, the kind of ease that came when people chose to trust him instead of fear him. He knew he carried damage, but he didn't want it to hurt anyone again. He tied his horse, rolled up his sleeves, and walked to the broken fence. His hands moved with practiced steadiness, measuring distances, checking the rails, pressing the soil around weak posts. The sisters stood back at first, unsure of him, but gradually drifted closer to understand how he worked. Naeli fetched tools when he asked. Ahiona held the rails steady while he hammered them in. Their movements grew more coordinated as the hours passed, like three people who had worked together before, though this was their first day. Elias didn't talk much. The few words he offered were practical, direct. But his silence wasn't cold. It was the silence of someone who spent years relying on observation instead of conversation. By late afternoon, the fence stood strong again. The sky darkened with the next storm moving in. Elias wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at the cabin, knowing the night would test all three of them in different ways. Inside that small home, he would have to sleep close to strangers he did not want to frighten and did not want to lose to a mistake. The sisters watched him quietly, aware of the weight he carried even without knowing the details. They had invited him in because they needed help, but as they stood together in the rising wind, they realized he needed this place just as much as they needed him. The storm rolled across the hills. Night approached, and the three of them stepped into the cabin, each carrying their own reasons for staying alive one more day. The storm pressed against the cabin through the night, but the worst of it passed before dawn. When the first light reached the windows, Elias was already awake, alert, breathing slowly, aware of where he was and who was beside him. He felt the weight of the sisters' trust in the small space they shared, and he used a long, controlled breath to steady the familiar tension in his chest. Nothing had gone wrong. No sudden panic. No reaching for his gun. The quiet inside the cabin settled into him more than he expected. Ahiona was the next to rise. She moved carefully so she wouldn't disturb anyone, but Elias had already stepped back from the bedrolls. He stood near the stove, shoulders lowered, hands resting calmly for the first time since arriving. Ahiona watched him with a new understanding. She had seen men wake in fear before, but he had woken with restraint instead of aggression. That said something about the discipline he carried. Naeli sat up soon after, brushing her hair back with quick, tired movements. She gave Elias a soft, cautious glance, checking whether he seemed different now that he had slept under their roof. Instead, she saw a man who looked restored in small ways, still worn, still guarded, but no longer ready to strike at every shadow. The morning was cold, and Ahiona began preparing tea while Naeli lit the stove. Elias offered a quiet thank you, without forcing conversation. He accepted the cup Ahiona handed him with both hands, as if careful not to break anything fragile. He stepped outside to check the fence line again, and the sisters followed soon after. The air carried the smell of damp soil, and the grass shone from the night rain. The fence stood straight, no rails loose, no tracks of animals or riders nearby. Relief crossed Naeli's face, brief but visible. Their horses grazed near the repaired stretch, no longer wandering toward the open land. Elias examined the posts a second time, pushing lightly against each one. It wasn't suspicion, it was habit. He trusted his work, but he trusted vigilance more. The sisters watched him closely, realizing he wasn't just checking the fence. He was checking the safety of the entire area with the awareness of someone who had lived through ambushes and mistakes he refused to repeat. Ahiona finally spoke. "You always look over your shoulder like that." Elias didn't hide the truth. "It kept me alive. I don't let myself relax until I know a place is steady." Naeli asked, "Is this place steady?" Elias scanned the ridge, the creek path, the tree line. For now, it wasn't fear speaking. It was calculation. Ahiona accepted the answer without pushing for details. They spent the morning repairing what the storm had damaged beyond the fence. Loose shingles on the roof, a cracked water barrel, scattered tools the wind had carried off. Elias worked with calm, focus, lifting beams alone, giving short instructions when the sisters needed guidance, moving with the efficiency of someone who knew how to survive without wasting strength. During these hours, the questions left hanging from the previous day naturally found their answers. The sisters learned why he had appeared on their land. He had been moving along quiet trails, avoiding towns, avoiding loud places, avoiding the kind of past that waited for him in crowded streets. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from the memories tied to a single night of misjudgment that cost a man his life. He never said the man's name or described what happened, but the pain in his voice explained enough. Ahiona shared, in her controlled way, how she and Naeli had remained on this homestead after their family was taken in a raid the year before. They were determined to defend what was left of their home, even if surviving alone wore them down one hardship at a time. The answers eased the unspoken tension between all three of them. Their missions, Elias's need for a place where he could breathe without fear, and the sisters' fight to protect their land, aligned without needing to be spoken directly. When midday arrived, Naeli brought leftovers from the night before. Elias accepted the food and ate with a calmness he had not felt in months. Ahiona watched him pause occasionally, as if still adjusting to the idea that someone cared enough to share a meal without expecting anything in return. As the sun climbed higher, Elias inspected the tree line again. Something in the distance caught his attention. Nothing alarming, just the faint signs of someone else having passed through the area days earlier. A broken twig where it shouldn't be. Tracks softened by rain, but still visible to a trained eye. He didn't raise alarm or announce danger. He simply noted it and turned back toward the homestead, deciding he would keep watch until he understood the land better. The sisters noticed he lingered close to the cabin instead of preparing his horse to leave. Ahiona wiped her hands on her skirt and asked, "You staying here until evening?" Elias looked at the ridge once more. Staying a bit longer wouldn't hurt. Naeli tried to hide the relief in her expression, but it showed anyway. They continued working together until the sun began to lower. The day had been steady, productive, and strangely quiet in a comforting way. The sisters began to see Elias not just as a traveler passing through, but as someone who could read danger before it reached their door. Elias began to see the homestead as a place where he wasn't expected to run at the first sign of trouble. When dusk settled over the hills, the three of them stepped back inside the cabin. Elias felt a calmer kind of tension this time. Not fear, not distrust, but the unfamiliar sensation of belonging somewhere, even if only for a short while. The storm clouds had moved far east. The land was still. And for the first time in a long while, Elias Ward felt that the night ahead might be one he could face without reaching for a weapon in the dark. The smell of the evening fire drifted through the cabin as Ahiona stirred a pot of stew. The day's work had steadied the homestead, yet the air carried a quiet unease that none of them voiced. Elias sat near the wall, sharpening his knife with slow, controlled movements. The sound of metal against stone was soft but constant, a rhythm that helped him stay calm while he processed the land he had chosen to watch over for another night. Naeli moved around the cabin gathering blankets, her steps quicker than usual. She kept glancing at the door, checking that the latch held firm. She wasn't afraid of Elias anymore. Her worry came from the land outside, the small disturbances he had noticed during the day. If someone had passed near their territory, she wanted to be sure they wouldn't return after dark. Ahiona placed bowls on the table, her face composed yet tight around the eyes. She wasn't one to speak her fears, but she felt them settling deeper tonight. She had seen Elias's gaze sharpen at the edge of the tree line earlier. She knew how to read the expression of someone who recognized danger, even if he didn't name it. When they ate, the silence was natural rather than strained. Elias kept his posture relaxed, but alert, tasting every bite with the appreciation of someone who had eaten too many meals alone. Ahiona studied him carefully, his steadier breathing, the way his shoulders loosened when he realized the meal required no conversation and no performance. Naeli watched him too, curious about how a man could look so worn and yet so disciplined at the same time. After the bowls were cleaned and stacked, darkness settled fully outside. The sisters prepared the bedrolls again, arranging them with more ease than the night before. They had already accepted that this was the safest way to keep everyone calm. Elias removed his boots and coat, folded them neatly, and placed his gun where it could be reached if necessary, though a part of him hoped he wouldn't need it. He lay down only after the sisters were settled, giving them space to choose their comfort first. Naeli lay on his right, her breathing sharp at first, then gradually slower as she adjusted to the warmth in the small space. Ahiona lay on his left, maintaining a respectful distance, but no longer braced with suspicion. The cabin felt more like a guarded refuge than a place of doubt. Outside, the wind pushed lightly against the walls. The noises of the land returned, small animal movements, the creek whispering through the rocks, branches shifting under their own weight. Elias listened to each sound, identifying them one by one. He hoped none belonged to anyone approaching the homestead. The questions that lingered from earlier in the story began to settle here without needing to be spoken. Why had Elias chosen to stay longer than the fence job required? Because he had seen signs that the sisters were not as safe as they believed. Leaving would have meant abandoning them to uncertainty he understood too well. Why did he place himself between them again? Because the weight of their safety pulled on him in a way he couldn't ignore. The arrangement wasn't about comfort. It was about control, awareness, and preventing a mistake his instincts might force on him in the dark. As the hours stretched, Naeli's shoulder brushed lightly against his arm. She flinched first out of habit, then settled back when she saw Elias didn't stiffen or react with alarm. Ahiona watched their small interaction without judgment. She understood that trust formed in moments like this, quiet, unplanned, honest. Elias kept his eyes open longer than necessary. The softness of the space felt unfamiliar, and familiar things often carried danger. But nothing shifted wrong in the cabin. The sisters breathed evenly. The land remained calm. Slowly, the strain in his chest loosened. His thoughts drifted toward the tracks he'd seen earlier. They were days old. Whoever passed hadn't returned. Still, he made a silent decision. He wouldn't leave the sisters until he knew with certainty that no threat was circling their land. The night deepened. Ahiona drifted into sleep with her hands tucked near her chest. Naeli curled slightly closer for warmth. Elias felt the weight of their trust settle over him in a steady, grounding way. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't question it. He simply let the tension fade enough for sleep to reach him slowly and cleanly, something he hadn't felt in years. The cabin held the quiet of people who no longer faced the dark alone. There were no footsteps outside, no shifting shadows beyond the door, no sudden jolts to pull Elias from rest. Only the steady breathing of 3 survivors who had unknowingly begun building a place they could all belong to. When Elias finally closed his eyes, it was with the understanding that tomorrow he would need to look beyond the repaired fence and search the land for new signs. If danger existed, he would find it before it reached the sisters. That thought, more than anything, allowed him to sleep without fear of waking into chaos. The night passed without trouble, laying the foundation for the changes that would come with the morning light. The first light entered the cabin quietly, spreading across the wooden floorboards and touching the edges of the bedrolls. Elias woke before the sisters, his breathing steady, his hand relaxed near his belt instead of clenched around a weapon. The calm surprised him. He didn't linger on it long. Calm had a way of leaving quickly if he examined it too closely. He sat up slowly, listening to the familiar morning sounds outside. The horses shifting near the corral, the faint splash of the creek, the branches settling after the night wind. Nothing in the pattern suggested trouble. That alone eased a layer of worry he didn't realize he'd been carrying. Ahiona stirred next. She sat up with her usual composed movements, her expression neutral as she took in the room. But she noticed the change in Elias immediately. His shoulders weren't raised. His jaw wasn't locked. The tension he normally carried wasn't pressing against the room the way it had before. She didn't comment on it. She simply acknowledged it with a small nod, as if the shift made sense. Naeli woke last, blinking against the morning light. She looked between Elias and her sister, checking the mood before speaking. When she saw no tension, her posture softened. "It's quiet outside," she said. Elias responded with a brief nod. "Land looks clear." There had been an unanswered question lingering from the nights before, whether Elias intended to stay only for the repairs or whether he had another purpose forming in his mind. That question dissolved in the natural way he moved around the cabin this morning, as if staying had become an unspoken decision rather than something he needed to justify. Ahiona prepared breakfast, sliding a tin plate toward Elias without hesitation. He accepted it with a quiet thank you. He wasn't a man who used polite words often, but in this house, speaking them felt necessary rather than forced. After they ate, they stepped outside together. The sunlight revealed the homestead with new clarity. The repaired fence, the horses grazing calmly, the faint traces of last night's wind smoothed into the soil. Elias studied the land again, this time not out of fear, but out of habit and responsibility. Naeli walked beside him. "You always look for trouble this early?" "Trouble shows itself before people notice," Elias answered. "Better to see it first." She considered that, nodding slowly. "Does it always find you?" "It used to," he said. The honesty came out before he meant it to. He let the truth stand without taking it back. Ahiona approached them with a coil of rope in her hands. Fence held through the night. No animals crossed. She paused, watching Elias closely. "You think someone will come this way?" Elias answered carefully, aware that truth and reassurance had to be balanced. Tracks farther out were old, but riders move through this land when they know people are alone. He looked directly at her. "You're not alone now." Ahiona didn't react openly, but something in her face eased. One of the questions that had lingered, whether Elias saw this place as a temporary shelter or a place he needed to guard, settled into a clear understanding. He wasn't planning to leave until he knew the land was truly safe. They worked through the morning together. Elias reinforced the northern posts, teaching Naeli how to angle the nails so the wood wouldn't split again under rain. Ahiona repaired the railings along the corral with steady precision. As they worked, Elias explained his methods with simple, direct guidance, giving the sisters skills they could use long after he was gone, even though a part of him wondered if he would stay longer than he expected. Later, they gathered near the creek. The sisters noticed how Elias always kept his back toward the open field, positioning himself to watch the land while they worked. He wasn't paranoid. He was trained by years of hardship to notice patterns before danger surfaced. One of the unspoken concerns from earlier chapters, the nature of Elias's past mistake, grew clearer when Naeli, curious but gentle, asked, "Is that why you wake so hard?" Something from before. Elias took a long breath. He didn't want to expose everything, but he didn't want them guessing wrong either. "There was a night, someone came into a camp while I slept. I shot before I understood who it was." His voice stayed steady, but the memory tightened the muscles in his throat. "I learned to keep people close so nothing like that happens again." Ahiona absorbed the explanation with quiet respect. Naeli, moved by the weight he carried, said softly, "We didn't mean it." "I still did it," Elias replied. He didn't offer excuses. He never had. The sisters didn't press further. Understanding was enough. By late afternoon, the three of them walked the full length of the property, checking for loose rails, broken branches, or signs of riders. The land felt different now, not just guarded but shared. The sisters spoke more freely around Elias, asking small questions, offering small smiles. Elias responded with the simplest expressions, but each one carried more openness than before. When the sun lowered and the temperature dropped, they returned to the cabin. The air inside felt familiar, no longer tense or uncertain. The arrangement for the night fell into place without discussion. They knew where each would sleep, how close, and why. The purpose wasn't questioned now. It had become part of how they protected one another. As the fire settled into a low glow, Elias sat near the wall again, scanning the room with a softer gaze. This place, these women, and the silence they shared. It all began forming something he hadn't expected, a sense of belonging that didn't feel temporary. The land outside held steady. No tracks, no smoke, no riders. For the first time in months, Elias felt that the danger pressing on his back had paused long enough for him to breathe. And the sisters, watching him quietly as the firelight flickered across the walls, understood that the man who had arrived as a cautious stranger was becoming necessary to their survival, just as they were slowly becoming necessary to his. The next morning carried a different weight. The air was crisp, the sky clear, yet Elias sensed a shift the moment he stepped outside. A horse snorted sharply near the corral, a sound that didn't match the calm of the homestead. He moved toward the fence with controlled steps, scanning the ground the way a scout studies the earth before choosing his path. Ahiona and Naeli joined him quietly. They had learned to read his posture, and the slight tightening around his shoulders warned them something wasn't right. Elias crouched near the edge of the fence where the soil softened after last night's dew. A single set of tracks cut through the dirt. Not from their horses, not from wildlife. Riders' tracks, fresh enough that the shape hadn't settled, old enough to be from the early hours of dawn. Ahiona's breath caught in her chest, but she kept her face controlled. Naeli stepped closer and studied the tracks with wide eyes, trying to match them with anything familiar. Nothing came to mind. They didn't come this way yesterday, Elias said, his voice even, but his jaw tightened. Someone circled the homestead when we were sleeping. That answered one of the lingering questions, whether the faint signs Elias noticed earlier had been harmless. They were not. Someone had tested the land twice now. Ahiona crossed her arms, grounding herself. Looking for what? Open ground. Weak fences. Whoever they were, they're studying the area, Elias said. They came close, but not close enough to be seen. Naeli looked around nervously. Do you think they'll come back? Riders who scout usually do, Elias answered. He paused, not wanting to alarm them needlessly. But it means we have time to prepare. The sisters exchanged a silent look. Fear wasn't new to them, but facing it with someone experienced changed everything. Naeli's hands shook slightly, and Elias placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Light, supportive, grounding. She steadied her breathing. Ahiona watched the gesture, surprised by how natural it looked on him. They walked the property together, searching for other signs. Twigs snapped in deliberate directions. A bush with leaves pressed down. A faint indentation near the creek, suggesting someone had crouched there to watch the homestead. Elias didn't miss any of it. He explained each mark in simple terms, not to frighten them, but to give them knowledge. This is how someone checks a place before coming back, he said. They watch, they walk slow, they see who's home and what they can take. Ahiona's expression hardened. She wasn't a woman who ran from danger, but she was tired of the land testing them again and again. Elias sensed the weight she carried, the responsibility she felt for Naeli, the grief she hid under quiet strength. He stood beside her, meeting her eyes with measured calm. You're not defending this place alone anymore. That truth filled the spaces between them, settling stronger than any promise. They spent the day reinforcing the homestead. Elias repaired weak sections of the fence with Ahiona's help, ensuring no horse could be stolen easily. Naeli moved supplies into the cabin, so nothing valuable stayed exposed. Together, they checked water barrels, secured tools, and cleaned out brush where someone might hide. While they worked, more of Elias's background surfaced naturally. Pieces of information the sisters hadn't asked directly, but needed to understand. He had lived through raids similar to the one that took their family. He had seen how groups operated, how they tested small homes, how they calculated risk. He explained patterns without dramatizing them, giving the sisters clarity on how danger approached quiet places like theirs. It also became clear why he reacted so strongly to nighttime threats. The man he had accidentally shot had been a friend who returned to their camp in the dark without warning. Elias had never forgiven himself for waking with fear instead of recognition. That mistake shaped every instinct that kept him alert even when exhausted. Naeli listened silently to this part of his past. For the first time, She understood the depth of the burden he carried. It wasn't paranoia, it was the memory of a moment he could never take back. In the afternoon, Elias walked the ridge alone to see whether the rider's trail continued farther. The sisters stayed behind, tending the horses and keeping their hands busy to quiet their worry. Ahiona tried to appear composed, but Nayeli noticed the stiffness in her movements. Elias returned near sunset with more information. One rider, not a group, but scouts don't travel alone. More might follow behind. Ahiona took a steady breath. How long do we have? Could be tonight. Could be days. Elias adjusted his hat and looked toward the fading horizon. We prepare as if it's soon. The decision he made next didn't need discussion. He would stay, not because he owed them anything, not out of pity, but because leaving them now felt unthinkable. Ahiona and Nayeli both sensed his choice before he stated it aloud. The small relief that passed over Nayeli's face said more than words. Ahiona didn't show relief, but the firm nod she gave him carried gratitude and respect. When darkness settled, they entered the cabin again. This time the night didn't feel like a routine arrangement. It felt like necessity. Elias positioned himself between them once more, but now the space held intention rather than caution. They shared warmth not out of fear, but as a quiet acknowledgement that they were facing whatever came next together. Outside, the land remained still, but it no longer felt empty. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the certainty of approaching riders hung in the dark. And inside the small cabin, 3 people braced themselves with silent resolve, ready to defend the fragile home they were beginning to build. The night passed without riders, but the silence outside the cabin carried the tension of something approaching. Elias woke before the sisters again, listening to the land the way a soldier listens for movement in the dark. Nothing stirred. No hoofbeats, no breaking branches. Yet he didn't take the calm for granted. Scouting riders rarely acted quickly. They watched, waited, and returned only when they believed the moment was right. Ahiona rose soon after, noticing the alertness in Elias's posture even before he spoke. She didn't ask whether the tracks still troubled him. It was written clearly in his eyes. Nayeli sat up slowly, her hair loose around her face, blinking away sleep as she followed their silent exchange. The first question that had lingered, how prepared were the sisters to defend their land if riders came, surfaced naturally as they gathered at the table. They had weapons, but their training had always been basic, meant for quick warnings rather than real confrontation. Elias understood this, and he spoke with calm clarity. You shouldn't face riders without knowing how to move, he said. We'll start today. Ahiona nodded with firm resolve. Nayeli swallowed hard, but she nodded too. Outside, the air was cool and clean. Elias began with simple steps. How to stand balanced, where to keep their hands, how to hold a rifle without tiring their arms or giving away their fear. He corrected their posture gently, showing Ahiona how to brace her shoulder and Nayeli how to steady her breath before pulling a trigger. He didn't rush them. He wasn't shaping them into fighters. He was teaching them to survive. As they practiced, another unspoken question resolved itself. Why had Elias chosen to stay and assume this role so willingly? The answer came without words. Every time he looked at the sisters, his expression tightened with something like recognition. He had seen families torn apart before. He had been too late once. He wouldn't allow that to happen here. Ahiona caught his expression during a pause. You carry this as much as we do, she said. Elias didn't deny it. They spent the late morning tending to the homestead. One of the horses, the youngest mare, limped near the corral. The wound on her foreleg from the storm debris had worsened overnight. Nayeli crouched beside her, worry tightening her features. Elias knelt beside the mare and inspected the leg carefully. It's not deep, he said, but it'll fester if we leave it. He cleaned the wound with water warmed on the stove, wrapped it with clean cloth, and showed Nayeli how to keep it dry. Her relief was immediate, her gratitude earnest. I didn't know how to handle it alone, she said quietly. You won't have to, Elias answered. This answered another question that had lingered from earlier chapters. What place did Elias have in this small family forming between them? It became clear in small scenes like this, not as a guest or a passing traveler, but as someone who belonged in the daily struggles of the homestead. Ahiona watched them from a short distance, seeing the ease with which Naeli followed Elias's guidance. She didn't interfere. Instead, she accepted how naturally he fit into their lives. Later, they repaired the water barrels together. Ahiona held the frame steady while Elias replaced the damaged rings. Naeli fetched tools, working in quiet coordination with him. Throughout the day, Elias explained why these repairs mattered if riders came, how water, horses, and secure storage could be the difference between surviving a raid or losing everything. It wasn't fear-mongering. It was preparation spoken with the authority of someone who had lived through too many close calls. In the afternoon, the faint smell of smoke drifted through the breeze. Not from the cabin. This scent came from farther out, somewhere near the distant ridge. Elias lifted his head sharply, his hand instinctively lowering toward his belt. Ahiona and Naeli froze, following his gaze. "Someone's making camp," Elias said quietly. "Too far to see from here, but close enough to be watching." Naeli's voice trembled. "How long before they come?" Elias studied the haze in the distance. "They're testing patience. Could be tomorrow. Could be the next day." He looked at both sisters. "We'll be ready." Dinner that night was simple. The mood in the cabin was quiet but steady. Naeli tried to hide her fear, but the tension in her shoulders exposed it. Elias sat closer to her, not touching, but close enough that she felt grounded by his presence. Ahiona noticed and placed a reassuring hand on her sister's knee. Another unanswered curiosity, the balance between fear and trust, found its resolution as the sisters shifted around Elias without hesitation. They no longer questioned why he stayed close. His presence didn't just protect them, it steadied them. When they prepared their bedrolls, the arrangement felt different than the nights before. There was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. The sisters lay on either side of Elias because it had become the safest way to sleep, not just physically, but mentally. Elias positioned himself between them with controlled care, ensuring they felt secure without being crowded. As the fire dimmed, Naeli whispered, "Do you think they'll attack at night?" "No," Elias answered. "Riders wait for daylight. They want to see the fear they're causing." Ahiona exhaled slowly, accepting the truth without flinching. "Then we meet it in daylight." "Exactly," Elias said. The wind outside shifted, carrying long stretches of quiet. The homestead held its breath, bracing for what was coming. Elias closed his eyes only when he felt both sisters settle against the warmth of the bedrolls, not relying on him, but sharing the strain of what lay ahead. The land outside was no longer silent, because it was empty. It was silent because someone beyond the ridge was watching the homestead, waiting for the right moment to return. And inside the cabin, 3 people prepared themselves with a unity that hadn't existed before, steady, unspoken, and stronger than anything the riders expected to find. The riders came just after dusk settled into the hills. The first sign was the sudden stiffness in Elias's posture as he stepped out to bring in the last bucket of water. The horses near the corral lifted their heads at the same moment, ears pointed toward the ridge. A distant, uneven echo of hoofbeats followed, slow at first, then steady enough to reveal intention rather than chance. Ahiona and Naeli stepped out of the cabin behind him, their faces tightening as they heard the same sound. Elias didn't need to say anything. His hand drifting toward the grip of his gun said enough. The questions that had lingered, how soon would the riders come, and in what numbers, found their answer in the dark silhouettes moving down the ridge. Inside, Elias said quietly. The sisters didn't argue. They moved back into the cabin while Elias closed the door behind them and barred it. He stayed near the window, peering through a narrow space between the shutters. 3 riders approached first. More shadows followed behind them at a slower pace. 5 total, maybe 6. Not a full gang, but enough to test the homestead if they believed it undefended. Naeli stood near the wall, her breath short but controlled, repeating what Elias taught her. Steady air, steady hands. Ahiona stayed close to the rifles, ready to pass one to him if needed. Neither panicked. They had already accepted that this moment would come. The riders circled the corral before stopping in front of the cabin. Their horses snorted and stamped the ground. One man dismounted, tall with a scar across his cheek, and walked toward the door with a slow, deliberate confidence. Elias stepped forward, unbarred the door, and pushed it open just enough to face the intruders without giving them a clear view inside. The scarred man smirked. "Quiet place you got here." "Doesn't need visitors," Elias replied. "When not visiting," the man said. "Just passing through. Thought we'd have a look around. Folks out here don't usually mind. This place minds." The man glanced past Elias's shoulder toward the faint movement inside. Ahiona shifting her stance, Naeli clutching the edge of the table. His expression sharpened. "We heard this homestead belonged to 2 Apache women." He tilted his head. "Didn't expect to see a man here." Elias didn't blink. "They're not alone. And who exactly are you?" "Someone who won't let you step past this door." The rider's smirk faded. The men behind him shifted in their saddles, reassessing the situation. Until now, they believed the homestead weak. 2 women, vulnerable land, nothing worth resisting. Elias's presence changed the math, and they didn't like it. The scarred man stepped closer. "We're looking for food, supplies, maybe a horse if you got extra. Not asking for trouble. You walk the ridge at night, watch from a distance, circle fences, and then call it asking?" Elias asked. The man froze for a brief second, surprised that someone had noticed their earlier scouting. "Didn't think anyone was paying attention," he muttered. "I paid attention," Elias answered. "Leave the property." The man's jaw tightened. He leaned in just enough to test Elias's resolve. "You think you can stand against all of us?" "I don't need to." Elias's voice remained low and steady. "I just need you to know it won't be worth the trouble." There was no threat shouted, no dramatic posture, only controlled certainty. The kind that came from a man who knew exactly how quickly violence could unfold and how final it could be. The rider hesitated. The men behind him sensed it. One of them reached for his rifle, shifting it across his lap. Elias's hand moved toward his holster, not fast, but with enough warning to show he wouldn't hesitate if pushed. Ahiona and Naeli held their breath behind the door. They didn't need to see outside to feel the tension rising. The scarred man finally lifted his hand, signaling the others to ease back. "Didn't come here to put anyone in the ground tonight," he said. "Maybe this place isn't worth what we thought." "Correct," Elias replied. The man stepped back, mounted his horse, and gave the homestead a long, calculating look. Elias saw the decision forming behind his eyes. The riders weren't finished. They would return, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon enough. "We'll be around," the man said. "Keep the fire burning. Makes it easier to see who's home." They turned their horses and rode off into the darkness, disappearing behind the ridge with slow, deliberate steps meant to remind the homestead that their retreat wasn't defeat, only delay. Elias closed the door firmly and barred it again. Ahiona approached him, her expression tight but steady. "They'll return." "Yes," Elias said, "but next time, they'll know we're ready." Naeli exhaled shakily, stepping closer to them. "Did they see us?" "Only enough to know you're not alone," Elias assured her. That's all they needed to see. He didn't say the rest. That their presence made the homestead worth taking to the wrong kind of man. That the riders had recognized value here, shelter, supplies, women, and wouldn't forget it. Instead, he focused on what mattered now. "We prepare from sunrise," Elias said. "They won't catch us off guard." Ahiona nodded. Naeli leaned into her sister's side, steadying herself. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, but something had changed. The sisters no longer felt helpless. Elias no longer felt like a stranger guarding someone else's land. They were 3 people standing against a threat together, a united front that the riders hadn't expected. Outside, the wind carried distant hoof echoes fading into the night. Inside, the small cabin braced for the days to come, strengthened by the decision that none of them would face what approached alone. Morning arrived with a sharp stillness, the kind that settled over the land when riders had passed through but not finished what they came for. Elias stepped outside before the sun rose fully, the air cold enough to cloud his breath. He surveyed the ridge where the men had disappeared hours earlier. There were no new tracks, no smoke, no movement, but the absence felt intentional, not comforting. Ahiona joined him with a steady expression, tightening her shawl against the chill. "They'll watch us before they act," she said. Elias nodded. She had learned enough from a night before to trust her instincts. Naeli stepped out next, quieter than usual, but determined. The fear from last night hadn't broken her. It had hardened something inside her, something that had been pushed down since the raid that took their family. One question that lingered: how prepared were the sisters to defend themselves if riders returned in daylight? Was answered when Elias gathered them near the fence. "We'll reinforce the line," he said. "Not just with wood." He showed them how to position heavy stones near weak posts, how to angle the rails so they wouldn't break under pressure, and how to create a bottleneck point near the corral where approaching riders would be forced to slow down. The sisters worked with unbroken focus. By the time the sun stood high above the hills, the homestead looked different. Not like a place waiting for trouble, but like a place ready to stand against it. They moved next to the cabin. Elias taught the sisters how to load and unload the rifles quickly, how to control their breathing, how to choose positions that offered cover without restricting their view. Ahiona grasped the techniques fast, her discipline firm. Naeli asked more questions, seeking clarity with every step. Elias answered each question directly, giving her confidence in actions that once frightened her. As they worked, another question found its resolution. Why was Elias fighting so hard for a home that wasn't his? That answer came in small details. The way he watched the sisters move, the way he positioned himself near them unconsciously, the way his tone changed when he said, "we instead of you." He wasn't protecting a homestead. He was protecting people he could no longer imagine leaving. They continued strengthening the grounds until late afternoon. At the creek, Naeli slipped on a wet stone while filling a bucket. Elias caught her wrist abruptly, pulling her up before she could fall. She steadied herself, breathing fast. "Thank you," she whispered. "Stay aware of the ground," he said, but his voice held concern rather than reprimand. Ahiona watched the moment quietly, recognizing the shift happening between the three of them. Elias wasn't just a man offering protection. He was becoming part of the foundation they leaned on. By evening, the day's work left all of them tired, but a controlled kind of tired, grounded, not defeated. They shared a simple meal, the fire crackling low. The cabin felt stronger too, as if the structure itself recognized the determination inside it. Naeli spoke first. "Do you think they come tonight?" Elias listened to the wind before answering. "Not tonight. They want the sun at their backs when they return." "How many?" Ahiona asked. "More than yesterday," Elias said. "But they expect fear. They expect we'll hide or run." Naeli straightened. "We won't run." "No," Elias agreed. "We won't." That statement resolved another quiet question the sisters had carried. Would Elias stand with them until the end, whatever that meant? His voice answered it without hesitation. When night finally settled, they prepared their bedrolls again. The tension between them had changed over time. Less about caution, more about closeness and the unspoken comfort of knowing someone lay on either side of Elias, grounding him just as he grounded them. Naeli rested close enough that Elias felt her breath soften into sleep. Ahiona lay with her back warm against his arm, trusting the shared space without fear or hesitation. For the first time, Elias didn't evaluate the room for threats. Instead, he listened to the steady rhythm of the sisters' breathing and let it settle into him like something he had searched for across miles of empty land. Outside the cabin, the night was quiet but not empty. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the riders regrouped. Somewhere behind the darkness, intentions sharpened. Inside, three people lay ready, not with bravado, but with unity formed through work, fear, patience, and a growing bond no rider expected to encounter on this homestead. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. But tonight, the ground felt firm beneath them. Tonight, they slept as people who refused to be broken apart. The riders returned at sunrise, exactly as Elias expected. The first warning came from the horses in the corral, ears high, bodies tense. each animal stepping in tight circles as if the ground beneath them vibrated. Elias rose immediately, his movements sharp but steady, every sense focused. The sisters followed him outside, their expressions alert, not panicked. They had worked for this moment. They had prepared. The ridge that framed the homestead now held moving shapes. 5 riders, then a 6th, all coming down in a slow, deliberate formation. Their leader, the scar man from before, rode at the front with a confidence that said he believed today would end in his favor. Elias stepped forward, stopping near the fence line. He didn't aim his gun. He didn't call out. He simply stood, broad-shouldered and unmoving, positioned so the riders understood this land was defended. Ahiona and Naeli stayed near the cabin door, rifles in hand but lowered, exactly as Elias had instructed, visible enough to matter, calm enough not to provoke. One of the lingering questions, would the sisters truly be able to hold their ground when danger arrived, was answered in the way they stood now. They were tense, yes, but not paralyzed. Each kept her breathing steady. Each watched the riders with awareness rather than fear. The training, the preparation, and the long days rebuilding their confidence had settled into them. The scar man slowed his horse a few feet from Elias. Dust drifted off the hooves, settling into the cold morning air. "You should have left when you had the chance," the man said. "This land's not worth dying for." "It is for us," Elias replied. The man looked past him toward the cabin. Ahiona met his stare without flinching. Naeli tightened her grip, but stood firm. "You're still here," the rider muttered. "Didn't think you'd stay." "They're not alone," Elias said. "You know that now." The man's jaw clenched. "We need supplies. You're outnumbered. Make this simple." Elias shook his head. "Turn back." The riders shifted, murmuring among themselves. One of them dismounted, stepping closer with a smirk. Elias didn't move, but his eyes locked onto the man's hand, drifting toward his weapon. It was a test, one meant to push him into fear or retreat. Instead, Elias spoke calmly. "Don't reach for it." The man hesitated, then grabbed the grip anyway. Elias moved first, not with wild speed or showy force, but with the exact control of someone who had survived real violence. He stepped forward, seized the rider's wrist, twisted it down, and drove the man to his knees before the others understood what had happened. The revolver fell into the dirt. Elias kicked it away. The scar man's horse reared, startled. The other riders reached for their guns, but froze when they saw Elias standing over their companion with calm precision. Not aggression, not panic, just certainty. "This doesn't end how you think," Elias said. Ahiona and Naeli stood ready behind him. They didn't raise their rifles. They didn't have to. Their calm, disciplined posture told the riders exactly what they needed to know. The homestead was not undefended. The scarred man's expression changed. His confidence cracked, replaced by calculation. He had expected fear, chaos, easy victory. Instead, he saw an organized defense led by someone who reacted faster and cleaner than any man among them. "You willing to kill over this?" the leader asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. "If you force it," Elias replied. The man looked around the property. The reinforced fence, the cleared brush, the cabin door braced with the sisters behind it, steady and prepared. This wasn't the vulnerable homestead he had scouted days ago. It had changed under Elias's presence. The women who lived here had changed as well. He clicked his tongue, signaling his men. "Mount up," he ordered. "Not worth it." The others hesitated, angry but unwilling to challenge his command. They pulled their horses back, glaring at Elias and the sisters as if trying to burn them into memory. "This isn't the end," the leader called out. Elias took a single step forward. "It is if you're smart." The man stared at him long enough to understand the truth in the statement. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back toward the ridge. The others followed, some casting frustrated looks over their shoulders, but none daring to return for the fallen gun. A silence settled across the homestead once the last rider disappeared beyond the hill. It wasn't the silence of danger. It was the silence that follows a choice made clearly and firmly. Elias exhaled, letting his shoulders relax at last. He stepped back toward the cabin, and the sisters came out to meet him halfway. Naeli reached him first, her hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of relief washing through her. "They're gone," she said. "For good," Elias answered. They saw enough to know they'd lose more than they'd gain. Ahiona looked at him for a long moment, her expression steady, yet carrying something deeper: respect, gratitude, and an acknowledgement that what happened today had changed everything. "You protected us," she said simply. Elias shook his head slightly. "We protected this home." The distinction mattered. The sisters understood it immediately. They stood together in the center of the homestead, the morning sun finally climbing high enough to warm the cold ground. The threat that once loomed over their land now faded into the distance, replaced by a quiet certainty. The riders weren't coming back. The homestead was safe, and their bond, formed through danger, trust, and shared resolve, had become stronger than any threat that had tried to break it. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow the land would feel like theirs again. The homestead stayed quiet long after the riders disappeared. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the ground, the fence rails, and the cold metal of the gun Elias had kicked aside. The danger had passed, and the land reflected that. No strange tracks, no lingering shadows on the ridge, no tension in the horses' movements. It was the first time in days that the air didn't feel weighted. Ahiona and Naeli walked the perimeter with Elias, examining the fence, the brush, and the trail leading away from the homestead. They didn't expect the riders to return, but they wanted certainty. They had learned from Elias not to rely on luck. The only marks left were the tracks from the retreating horses, fading into the distance, already losing shape under the morning wind. Naeli crouched beside one of them, touching the disturbed soil. "They won't risk coming back," she said. "No," Elias answered. "They saw enough to know this place isn't easy to take." Ahiona looked toward the ridge with a controlled breath. "We held our ground." Elias nodded. Together. That single word settled something deep inside all three of them. One of the quiet questions that lingered, would Elias leave now that the danger had passed, had begun forming in the sisters' minds. And Elias felt that question sitting in his own chest too. For years, he had moved from place to place, avoiding ties, avoiding routine, avoiding anything that resembled a home. But this land, this cabin, this pair of sisters staying didn't feel like a risk anymore. Inside the cabin, the remains of the morning meal still sat on the table. Ahiona started clearing bowls, moving with a sense of relief so deep that her usual reserved expression softened. Naeli poured water into the kettle, humming without realizing it. Elias watched them, unable to ignore the ease settling between them, ease that hadn't existed before he arrived. Naeli looked up at him. "You saved us," she said. Elias shook his head gently. "You weren't helpless. You stood your ground. You faced them." She smiled faintly. "Only because you taught us how." Ahiona approached, placing a cloth on the table. "You could have walked away after fixing the fence," she said. "But you didn't." Elias met her gaze. "Didn't want to." That answered another unspoken question, the one tied to his past. He had carried guilt for too long. He had lived believing he brought harm by being close to others. But here, with these two women, he had protected instead of harmed. He had acted without panic. He had chosen to stay rather than run. This place had given him something no other place had, a reason to stop moving. Ahiona stood quietly, searching his face for anything uncertain. "So," she said, her tone steady, "what will you do now?" Elias looked around the cabin, the land visible through the window, the fence they had built together. He looked at the sisters, one strong and guarded, one warm and spirited. He thought of the nights lying between them, not as a shield, but as a man who finally trusted himself enough to rest. "If you'll have me here," he said, "I'd like to stay." Naeli's breath caught. Relief, happiness, something bright and human rising in her chest. Ahiona's expression didn't change immediately, but her eyes softened in a way that spoke louder than words. "This is your home if you want it," Ahiona said. Elias felt the truth of that settle deep inside him. The wandering, the years of sleeping half awake, the regret he had carried, they all loosened at once. He hadn't expected a place to welcome him, much less two people who understood the weight he carried and didn't ask him to set it down before he was ready. The day moved gently after that. They tended the horses, repaired minor damage left by the riders, and gathered supplies from the creek. For the first time, the work felt like planning for a future instead of surviving another day. By evening, the sky warmed with gold, casting long shadows across the homestead. Elias helped bring water inside, while Nayeli lit the stove. Ahiona prepared blankets for the night, her movements calm, natural, as if the routine had belonged to the three of them for years. When they settled into their bedrolls, Elias lay between them once more, but the reason had changed. There was no threat driving the arrangement, no fear of waking violently, no need for distance or caution. Nayeli rested her head near his shoulder, relaxed and unafraid. Ahiona lay close on the other side, steady and warm, trusting the closeness instead of guarding against it. Elias breathed in slowly, feeling the quiet of the cabin press around him. Not empty, not dangerous, but full in a way he hadn't known was possible. He glanced at the sisters. "You're safe," he said softly. Ahiona replied, "We know." Nayeli added, barely above a whisper, "And so are you." The fire dimmed, leaving only the glow of embers. The land outside remained calm. The ridge that once held danger now stood beneath a peaceful sky. Elias closed his eyes with a steady, grounded sense of belonging he had never felt in his wandering years. The homestead was no longer a place he passed through. It was home, and the sisters were no longer strangers he protected. They were the family he had finally found and chosen to stay with. The story ended as the night settled quietly around them, carrying no uncertainty, no loose ends. Only a home rebuilt, a future claimed, and three lives bound together by choice, trust, and the simple act of staying.